All right, at this time I want to introduce Deb Cambron. She is a fiber goddess. We're doing indigo dye. She spins, she weaves, she knits, she does all the cool stuff. And we did dyeing down at Kids Day yesterday, which was really fun. You pull the indigo out, it looks bright green and then it turns slowly blue. So today she's going to talk about a hat that was found in the latrine. Again, here's Deb. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to ask my esteemed colleague, Mark West, to come and model a representative sample of the latrine hat.
I think, can I pass it around?
Sure. And I have two hats that I'm going to pass around that will be available for auction this afternoon. And I would encourage everyone who attends the auction to bid high and bid often. Thanks, Mark. So this hat, the original information came from an article that was in Spin-Off magazine, and me being a fiber person, I subscribe to a lot of fiber-related publications. And I found this extremely interesting because textiles are not normally found in archaeological digs. And given the time period and given all the conditions, it's really kind of a miracle that they were able to not only find it, but recreate it. So the person, and you can go out on YouTube and you can look this up. Look up Fort Louisburg or Louisburg. I think we call it Louisburg, don't we? It's pretty interesting. The lady gives a very long, intensive talk about it. Her name is Dr. Anne Marie Hatcher, and a quote from her is, "We will never know how the hat ended up in the latrine, but we can be thankful that it did because the organic ooze that surrounded the textile preserved it." Imagine, okay. And Ray wanted me to use some tongs to hold up the hat, given the fact that it's a latrine hat. And I kind of missed that cue, but anyway, it was a good idea, Ray. So anyway, allow me to explain how this well-preserved hat opens a small window of life in the French colony of Louisburg in the middle of the 18th century when the hat was lost in a communal privy. So think of the time period and think of how Spartan things were back then. People were involved in sustenance living. Anything that they had was very near and dear to them. You know, we have trouble thinking about what they lived in and the conditions they suffered through because we can only relate to what we see every day of our lives. So picture this, the latrine was a 5-holer in the hospital. And the hat was hand-spun, hand-knitted, and the rest we say is history. The French colony of Louisburg was established on the Isle Royale, Cape Breton, Canada in 1713 for France to control the productive cod fisheries of the surrounding ocean and to serve as a center of commerce. If you pulled this up, and I apologize, I didn't really find enough pictures to make a PowerPoint worthwhile, but the whole fort and the surrounding area, it's a pretty good size area. So over the next 45 years, an impressive, well-fortified colony developed, and it was named after the reigning French king, good old Louis XIV. It was the site of many battles, and it flipped between the British and the French control several times before being abandoned by the British in 1768. So now fast forward to 1960. And there was a massive reconstruction that commenced with a labor force from the closed coal mines. In 1961, the Right Honorable John G. Diefenbaker announced the fortress of Louisburg to be restored partially so that future generations can thereby see and understand the role of the fortress as a hinge of history. I really like that, a hinge of history. The restoration is to be carried out so that the lessons of history can be animated. So enter Barbara Kelly Landry, who has been animating the spinning and knitting practices at the fortress for the past 30 years. It was Barbara who commissioned to analyze and eventually reproduce a usable copy of the artifact hat. And for those of you who are interested, I have a copy of the original article, and I bet if you're really nice to Sandra Cabot, she might make you a copy of it if you're really interested. Anyway, it took Miss Barbara about 2 months to count the stitches and the rows under a microscope. Now imagine, what was left of this hat was maybe 70% of it somewhat intact, and it had been buried all those years, and now she's looking at it under a microscope. And what she was able to determine was the yarn size and the gauge and even the needle size. So she has examined it, and she determined not only the construction but the shaping with the decreases. They know that there were no spinning wheels imported to the fort, which I find interesting. But, people see me spinning all the time, and they just think that everybody had a spinning wheel, and that's just not true. And even in third world countries today, the spinning's done with drop spindles, and they're pretty sure that the yarn that was spun for this hat was done on a drop spindle. It was the work of an obvious experienced knitter and spinner. The yarn was continuous with no knots and no breaks. And the spinning was very fine, and not even over twisted. That too is pretty remarkable given the conditions and probably what they had to work with. And it's a 2-ply, and in our terms, the yarn equates to be a fine sock yarn. So the hat was worked in 3 parts: a band, which was purled on the right side so that it was turned up. The knitted row side would show, which you can see in the hats that are being passed around. There were a gradual series of stacked decreases with knitted rows between and decreases that finally closed the top of the hat. Note that hats like this, in most of the textiles of the period, there were no patterns. People of that time period were generally illiterate, and everything was passed down verbally, or it was by sight. In other words, grandma would teach the children, and hopefully they were good visual learners and they got it, but it was just passed down by word of mouth. And that's why patterns from that time period don't exist. And any of us who are lucky enough to find a pattern from that time period and be able to interpret it and use it, that's pretty phenomenal. And it's a rare gift to be able to do that. And Diane's smiling back there because she knows what that is. And also, we need to think that the time period 1730, they think that's kind of when the hat was lost. It was when the hospital opened, and it was unearthed in around 1959 or 1916. That was 200 years later in this archaeological dig. I mean, that's just phenomenal. And of course, we know that textile artifacts are not nearly as common as those made of wood or clay because they just don't preserve easily. Rich spots to find well-preserved tactile artifacts are natural bogs and constructed latrines. Wool survives well in those environments because of the scarcity of aerobic bacteria, which require the oxygen and mildly acidic conditions. The practice of adding lime to the contents of the latrine to lessen the unpleasant odors may have irreparably degraded the wool artifact because of the alkaline chemical that neutralizes the acidity. Although wool in the hat does show signs of scale removal on the outside of the fiber, scales being it's an attribute that is only associated with wool, and that's the principle that allows wool to shrink. The remaining yarn really is in very good condition in the original hat. Even more interesting is that a nearby stream may have diluted any lime that was used, and the underground flush of the stream, it is thought, also dyed the hat a rich brown because of the iron and the tannins involved in the stream water. The hat was probably a natural sheep color when it was lost, And no time or effort was spent, on coloring utilitarian garments for the working class in the 18th century. That's a question I always get is, well, what did they dye? What did they use for dye? And the answer most generally is they didn't do a lot of dyeing. These people were in a sustenance kind of situation. Every day for them, it was how are we going to get food for this day? And if there was any time left at all, it was spent preparing the yarn and trying to make something from it. They weren't really concerned on aesthetics. It was more, I've got to stay warm, what can I make? I need to eat, what can I find? They just didn't have time for making these wonderful embellished garments that we so often see, at least not in that condition at that fort. So unlike the tricorn normally worn by men of all ages in Louisburg, the hat in the latrine had a sensible and functional use. This is practical headwear, and as you can see how Mark wore it, very functional. The hat fit the head tightly, which makes it a little unusual that it would be lost in a latrine, if it really fit the gentleman well, but who knows, maybe he had a little bit too much to drink, who knows. But the hem is doubled around the edge, and that fits right at the ears, so it was extremely warm, and it would help prevent to lose the hat in windy weather. And it can be deduced that this hat style is similar to the English Monmouth hat, which was commonly worn in nearby New England. And Clarence has a really good Monmouth hat that he wears occasionally. He doesn't have it with him today, but his daughter has a really good pattern for it. So anyway, to recap it all, of course, look what he's wearing today. So anyway, to kind of recap it all, over the years that all of this archaeological work occurred at the fortress, 5.5 million artifacts were collected, stored, and studied. Now that's phenomenal, and it's a shame we can't just all go there today and have a look-see. This collection is one of the largest in the world, representing the French colonial era. How about that? And that's it. That's the story.
That's right. That's how we support this event, is the auction in the afternoon. We do have a potluck in the evening too. So we're going to have a quick round table with our speakers.
Fire away.
Did you write a book also?
Yes, I did. I've written 2 books. I've written one called Arrow Rock Crossroads of the Missouri Frontier, and I wrote another one, the People of the River's Mouth in Search of the Missouri Indians. And a lot of the stuff that I spoke about there is in that book.
You don't have them on hand?
No, I don't. You can get, you can find them on Amazon, and the University of Missouri Press they did the Missouri book. So, yeah, it's just kind of a hassle to get a bunch of books and drag them around and then count out all the money and everything. I bet Tim would agree with that.
So in your research, the Osages are really tall?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're the pure blood Osage today, they're still pretty tall. Let's see, I know Sam Fletcher, who's a great-great-grandson of Black Dog. Black Dog was almost 7 feet tall and weighed almost 300 pounds. Sam's not that heavy, but I look up to him when I talk to him, and I'm 6'2", so yeah. But everybody noted that the men were pretty tall. The women were average size, but the men were tall.
Where did the Osage come in the Great Lakes area and the Iroquois drove them out? And they came to Illinois, Missouri?
Well, we get into really, the Osages believe that they're descendants of the Mississippian culture, Cahokia, the mound builders. And I tend to agree with that because in archaeological excavations of Mississippian sites, first off, let me say, I think the Mississippian culture was not a tribe. I think that a lot of tribes came out of that culture, that they were more like city-states, that maybe this one spoke this language, and this town spoke this language, and so forth and so on. They just shared broad, similar culture and mound building and stuff like that. But we know a lot of the artifacts that are excavated from Mississippian sites are, you can identify that iconography with current Osage iconography. And I know of Osage elders that have looked at stuff that from Mississippian symbols and stuff, and they would explain what it was and what it meant. And you look at it and go, oh, that makes sense. So, to say they were actually driven out by the Iroquois, I don't, it gets real muddled the further back in the past you go. We do know that the Iroquois basically drove the Shawnee, the Miami, the Illinois, everybody out. The Illinois ended up moving into Missouri for a period of time to get away from the Iroquois. And Wisconsin in the early 1600s was just jammed up full of people who were fleeing the Iroquois expansion. So, whether the Osage were or not, I don't really, have never found anything to indicate that.
One other
Sure.
question. The Osage brought the last remaining mound in St. Louis.
Yes, sure.
And what are their long-term plans?
I think their long-term plans are just simply to preserve it because it's the last mound in St. Louis. And that was their whole objective because they see it as part of their original heritage and they just wanted to save it from being destroyed. So I think that's all they're planning to do. They might develop a little parking area and interpretive sign, but I know there was a house built on the mound, and I don't know, I haven't been there in a long time, I don't know if the house has been demolished yet or not. But that's it.
So how did you get started in your research for all these books and things? Were you always interested in this particular time period, or what sparked your interest?
Okay, you asked if I was always interested in this period when I got started. Well, not always. It started in 1956. If any of you remember, they re-released the movie Northwest Passage in the theaters. Originally it came out in 1940. And my parents took me to see that, kicking and screaming, because I was into battles and shooting and, all the good stuff. And I thought it was going to be about explorers. But I was wrong. It was about Rogers' St. Francis raid. And up to that time, I mainly get interested in the Western Plains Indians and the cavalry and all that stuff, which was the main TV fare of the 1950s. But when I saw that movie, I was just captivated by it. I took my best friend, John Jager, and went to see it about 3 times that week, and we started playing Rangers, and it just became addictive. It's like crack. Once you're hooked, you're hooked. So we started out, even before I was in college, we were doing black powder shooting and stuff like that, and then we started reenacting, especially before the bicentennial. We did some Red Horse stuff, but our main interest was always in the French and Indian War, and I just kept working, learning, studying. My first writing effort was my First World War book that probably most of you have seen. That started out as a slide presentation for a local history group. And I thought, well, this is a lot of work for just doing an hour talk. So I thought, I'll do a magazine article. I quickly found out it was too much information for just a magazine article. So I published the first edition of that book myself. If you've ever seen the one with the brown leather-like cover, that's the first edition. And it's now in its third, actually technically its second edition and third printing. So it's still out there doing well. And I'm still hooked.
Well, there's actually two separate hats. There is the Voyager hat and there is the Corps d'Ivoire. And the Corps d'Ivoire was worn by the folks coming down from Canada, the fur traders. And the Voyager was generally worn by the folks that were coming up the river from New Orleans. And the difference in the two hats, the Corps d'Ivoire is much longer. They could store more things in the tip of that hat. Their journey was a little bit longer. There's a lot of research material out there on both of the hats. There is, thank you.
So they use the hat for their tobacco and all their stuff when it's dry?
Right. They would stuff it in the tip of the hat, and then the tip would be stuffed into the brim of the hat that was rolled up and made secure.
So no tassel?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depended on who made the hat. Yeah, it wasn't a requirement per se. It was more of an embellishment.
Okay, great. On the Voyager hat and everything, militia picked that up.
That's right. Good point, yes.
And also the military with their fatigue hats, sort of.
A lot of them were made very thick, and they were very tightly knitted, so they would hold up. And, you know, as we know, they didn't wash or launder things very often, so they had to be pretty substantial, you know, to go through the weather conditions, to be worn constantly. Same thing with the socks. I have a sock that I usually show folks. It's really from the Lewis and Clark period, but they were all made somewhat similar, and they're very substantial, very thick, and people they can't believe it. But that's how they made the sock. You only had one pair, generally. So it better be made to last. And the one I have, the pattern I have from the Lewis and Clark period, it has 800 yards of yarn in it. 800 yards, yes, for one sock.
So they felted it after?
It felted on the foot. They didn't take their socks and shoes off very often, and so the boots weren't made well. Or, you know, if you could find a pair of boots that were made anywhere close to the size of your foot, you were in good shape. And the socks were your buffer between your foot and the boot, and it kind of helped with the blister issue. You know, if they were marching long miles every day, you needed that. And, I do a lot of Civil War reenacting too, and I have a little issue with the folks that have these accounts where they say, oh, well, the women would knit 2 or 3 pairs of socks a day for the soldiers, and that's just really physically impossible. I work full time. It took me 6 weeks to make the one sock, the Lewis and Clark sock, and I will tell you there will never be a second sock. I just not going to do it. It's size 1 and 2 needles, like poke hammer size. It's just really a chore, a really hard chore. And the thing that we forget too, they were working with substandard materials. I mean, think of the wool that would have been spun on a drop spindle, rough, lots of slubs in it, bumps, and knitting needles. You just didn't go out and buy them. You might have used a tree twig, and wouldn't even have been to size, you know, and if they had access to any kind of wires or anything like that, they may have used a wire. I mean, they didn't have anything finished product like we're used to today. It was rudimentary. And we forget about that. You know, the fact that they were producing anything at all that was wearable is kind of a miracle. Yeah.
So did the English have spinning wheels? Since the French, they said don't, you can't, you gotta have the all fiber from the motherland. I mean,
Well, everybody had their idea of a spinning wheel. Yes.
Presidential Macron, they had spinning wheels up there.
I don't think they did, and I just heard that recently.
Mhm.
But as far as the eastern colonies, I know that they did. They had wheels and simple looms, and the drop spindle, of course, was very common. But I just recently heard that they had uncovered what they thought was convincing information that they hadn't made it to Mackinac yet. That kind of surprised me. We all get surprised by stuff that we thought we knew, and then we find out we didn't. That's part of the fun of this.
It certainly evolved in the history of the 7 Years' War.
Yes.
Certainly evolved some hard liquidity.
Yeah. Well, I got this. Let me ask a question. Do any of you out here have my Robert Griffin book, the one with the green cover?
Yeah.
Hang on to them. They're sold out, and they're going in the used book market for $600 to $800. Wish I had a whole box of them to sell it at. Yeah, I do have copies of my other books. I'm not a big high-pressure salesman, but if anybody wants one.
Amazon did have one yesterday for $4.
For $4? Oh, that's a steal. Yeah. Some guy told me last summer they had a Robert Griffin weekend up in Pennsylvania, and I went, and he brought mine through the line for me to sign, and I've actually seen them at $600 to $800, but he told me he saw some on the internet for $2,000 to $3,000. You know, I'm not going to say that as a true statement because I didn't verify it myself. But $600 to $800 I have seen. So.
What's really cool about your slideshow is I don't know if anybody else here recognized a bunch of our friends in the slideshow, but I did. I was like, oh, there's Dave, there's Jerry Biggs, there's, you know, I could have named a bunch of stuff. And that was pretty cool.
I use a lot of Robert Griffin stuff, a lot of Gary Zaboli's stuff, and stuff that's in the public domain. But I think, you know, I get up there in Babylon. But what really interests people is if you have good illustrations that are relevant to what you're talking about. So for all my programs, I try real hard to get good representative pictures. You did too. I've got some really good slides. That keeps my interest. I can actually do two things at one time: look at the pictures and listen to the words. Okay, everybody have a question?
You said the socks are really uncomfortable. I have seen the little scratchy too. What do people do to soften the fibers against the solder?
Nothing that I know of. That's
It gets softer as you wear it.
Yeah. But, you know, well, I mean, look at Mark sitting back there now.
It gets softer as you wear it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the oils from your
hair.
scalp would
Yeah.
build up. And, you know, remember they didn't wash them. So, you know, the oils, and a lot of times, you know, they didn't wash the fleeces very much. So the original lanolin was still in there too. So that kind of helps soften.
And plus, they didn't know any
And waterproof too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They didn't know any better or know any different. than
That's right, yeah.
they have.
Yeah, Albert makes a good point. That's the other thing, we know what we know from today, and to us, it would be scratchy, but to them, it's just the way it was, you know? So they're used to it. Yes.
You mentioned drop spindle, enough familiar with that. I'm familiar with spinning wheels.
Mhm.
But what is the other method?
Drop spindle, I wish I had one with me, I don't.
I can call a picture on my phone.
Yeah, it's a vertical kind of spinning, so it's a weight on a stick. And it is enough of a weight that when you twist it, the twist will continue and travel up the fibers and make it into yarn.
as opposed to the horizontal kind of spinning that's from a spinning wheel.
Has anyone come across a date when they started making it up in my shoes?
Oh, I don't know, Mike?
That's right. I'm thinking that during the colonial period, I read that they started to be made, but as far as a specific date, I can't say. And I think they were probably rare because if I'm not mistaken, just about all the examples that I have seen of originals are straight last. So they take a shape after you wear them. Although I've also heard that people would alternate feet so they wouldn't take a shape.
That's not true.
Yeah, I've wondered about that myself. I mean, get shoes broken into where they're comfortable. Why do you want to mess with it? You know. But my answer is I don't think we know.
Would royalty or those who could afford it make shoes specifically for the foot? I've always wondered, they had the money, they had a custom.
You know, I may be able to come up with an answer for that. I have a friend out east who's a real high-class female reenactor that knows all kinds of stuff. I'll text her when we're done here, and maybe I'll have an answer for you later today, at least as best as she can tell me.
Government contractors making footwear for the Army by the 1850s were making things on right and left. But how much sooner than that? Civil War, all the soldiers were wearing right and left. So probably starting in the 1850s at least, government contractors were manufacturing footwear on the right and left. But as far as the earlier date, I'm not sure either. I've never really found anything for sure on that.
Well, I think in ladies' shoes, for sure, like a fancy ladies' shoe, it's going to have a right and left, buckle that you're going to use. The way they have the fancier shoes buckled. So it's going to, whether it's straight last or pointy, it's going to go right or left. Like mine has a smaller inner buckle attachment, so it only would be watchable.
I know that my straight last shoe was
Do you have that so much on I was going to ask?
And
High-end shoes.
I'd like to switch that. That'd be awful.
awful if each were drawn.
The design would force the issue.
Absolutely. The design reports the issue. So certainly.
What got Pontiac stirred up to start his war against the British?
Well, kind of what I mentioned in my talk, only a lot more of it. The different trade policies, the French were very open and giving in their presence, and the British were not. Amherst in particular, there's a quote I didn't use that I read where he talks about, why should they be rewarded for their good behavior? I also mentioned, some of the British authorities and some of the officers treated the Indians badly. Others tried to be fair and understand it. And I think that came out in my talk if you listen to the way the commanders at the different posts, the relations they had with their local Indians. But it just was like two different worlds. And the British came in with different attitudes, more of an intent to actually occupy the land where the French were just passing through it. They sent their traders out into the Indian country. That was a big issue for the British. They wanted them to come to a central location and trade. And part of that was well-intentioned. It was because they didn't want the traders to cheat the Indians. But what the Indians wanted was for the traders to come to them. And when Rogers became commandant at Michilimackinac, one of the things he did was he allowed the traders, both the French and the British traders, to go out into the western country. And he just basically took it on himself.
The center of the alphabet was
to change the policy, and eventually he kind of won over the superiors back east. And it made it very popular with the traders and very popular with the Indians. So, just like anything you run into, there's good and bad, and there were some bad Indians. I brought up some of the stuff they did, it wasn't quite, the best either. So, it basically was just three different cultures coming together, and the French, frankly, probably were a little better at assimilating with the Indians, and the British had a few more rough edges, and it eventually led to the war. So,
Speaking of Rogers and speaking of hats, he had quite a contraption. But what was that build of the hat that he used to wear?
are you talking about the flap in the front?
Yeah, was it like a full pheasant?
We really don't know.
Oh, okay.
The hat itself, they came in both felt and leather. It was a light infantry style hat. It's not something he invented. The light infantry was already wearing it. And some of them were very hard, of foiled leather. And some of them were just like a tricorn that's cut down.
Yeah.
Like mine is. And I cut like off 3/4 of the bill and turn it up in the front. And it's either held with a button or a hook and eye, so you can let it down and it looks like a baseball cap. But it protects your eyes in the summer. And all my years of running through the woods, it's much more practical, much more comfortable than wearing a tricorn. Not much. Well, a tricorn, all it does is collect the rainwater too. You tip your head to one side. But a tricorn does give you more protection than a flat back.
The decor that you had above that was it?
Yeah, that shows up in a print. It's almost a Reservoir print, and it's part of a whole series that some entrepreneur came up with of all the people in America as the revolution was boiling up. So you look at the faces in them, and everybody that's part of that series of print, the faces all look alike. So you cannot rely on that big actor's face at all. There's another one of them meeting with Pontiac, where he's kneeling and Rogers is standing. And that probably is a more accurate painting or drawing. But the uniform in that is also a later period. It's more of a regular uniform. Like Pontiac, we have no big, really contemporary picture of Rogers. Okay. I don't want to monopolize the time.
I also want to ask a question about the Shawnee when they were brought in, and that round apple tree.
Yes, it was. They actually kind of ended up in several locations, but Apple Creek, there was a big settlement there at Shawnee was. Yeah.
Now, what is the Osage culture today? I mean, they're not a reservation tribe. That existing culture.
Well, if you go to Oklahoma, you'll see a sign that says "Welcome to the Osage Nation Reservation." They do. They kind of spar with Oklahoma over the terminology yet today. They call it an underground reservation because the Osages have all the mineral rights to everything 3 feet under the ground in the whole of Osage County, which used to be the reservation. And when the government allotted or broke up all the reservations in Oklahoma, they did that so Oklahoma could become a state. The Osages were the last holdout. And Oklahoma could not become a state until that reservation was broken up in that process called allotment. And Chief James Bigheart, this was about 1904, Chief Bigheart had actually been educated, he was a traditional Osage, but he'd actually been educated in Catholic schools, and he understood the law. And when the government, basically they forced allotment on them even though they didn't want it. They bought that land with their own tribal resources. so they wouldn't have to sell it, but that didn't matter to the U.S. government. They were going to make them sell it anyway. So Chief Bighart, when they were negotiating the allotment process, he inserted the language in there that the Osages would retain all the mineral rights to the reservation before it was broken up. Well, nobody cared. Nobody thought anything about it. And then lo and behold, they found oil on it. And then, you know, there were all kinds of schemes by the government, by, you know, criminal plans by locals to steal that oil money away from them and stuff. There's a good book written about now by David Gann, Pillars of the Flower Moon, and stuff. So the Osages stay, they still have a reservation, and it's an underground reservation. But like I said, they spar with the Oklahoma government over making that claim. But you go down there, you'll see the sign right there on the boundary that says it. Okay. Where? It's in northeast Oklahoma, just north of Tulsa. Actually, the tip of it touches northern Tulsa. But, pardon? Oh, okay.
Could you talk about the Indian settlements around the River Tear in the Mississippi?
I know the Illinois, probably it was Kaskaskia, had some settlements along the River Tear for a while. I'm not sure if the Shawnees and Delawares got up there. I just don't recall they did. But I know the Illinois, Kaskaskia, the Illinois did for a period of time. And that was part of that time when they were leaving Illinois and trying to get away from the Iroquois, and they came over into Missouri.
Can you say a word about Kickapoo? I've seen that name in northwestern Louisiana, south of Shreveport. I don't know where they started, where they came from, and how they got to Louisiana.
The Kickapoo were originally, they're a Algonquin-speaking tribe. They're related to the Shawnees and the Ottawas and the Potawatomis, and they were originally in central Indiana, Illinois, and they came across the Mississippi a lot. Came into this area on hunting, fighting with the Osage and so forth. But yeah, they were. There was a real good diorama of a Kickapoo village at the Illinois State Museum that they had. But yeah, they were kind of central Illinois. Central Indiana was their main homeland originally. Interesting thing about the Kickapoo, of all the tribes in North America, they're probably the most. There's probably more pure-blood Kickapoos per capita than there are just about any other tribe. Almost all of them can speak their language. There's three groups of them. There's one band, the Prairie Band in Kansas. There's another group in Oklahoma, and then there's a third group on the Texas-Mexico border. The Kickapoos, in the Algonquin language, Kickapoa means he wanders about or moves about. And the Kickapoos, at one time by the early 1800s, Kickapoos were strung out everywhere from Indiana all the way through central Kansas and all the way down to Mexico. They attached themselves, the Plains Kickapoo, they call them Wild Horse Kickapoo, they attached themselves to some of the Plains tribes. And they're a real interesting history on their own. They're very staunch traditionalists. They don't talk much about their culture or anything with anybody. Most of them can speak their language. But the three groups kind of interact with each other quite a bit.
Take a minute, and we're going to take a break. We're going to take a break till our heritage auction at 2 o'clock. I hope everybody can come out.
We don't have just historical items at the auction. There's some things that people that are not reenactors are gonna like too. And I want to take a minute to thank Mike and Deb and Tim for coming down and giving us the talk. Thank you very much. So that concludes the program up here today. Thanks for coming.